I believe I was in 5th grade, so that would have been in 1990, and so 33 years ago. I'm not great at math, but I could figure that one out. I was standing about where that keyboard is, and I had the role of the teacher in the Christmas program. The program that year was something called 365 Days of Christmas each year. I even had a little bit of a solo in one of the songs. Please hold your applause for the end. No, actually, please don't applaud me. So here's like the little bit I can remember, but this was 33 years ago, so I think it's pretty good that I remembered this. Christmas in July, there's no reason why we can't have a Christmas tree so high. And like there was like 2 more lines, but that's all I could remember, but I think that's all right. And shout out to Holly Heiser, who was the program director that year. And when I was cleaning out my dad's house this past summer, after he passed away, I found the dress that my mom sewed for me for that role. So that was really fun. I love Christmas programs. When I served as family minister, I loved teaching Go Tell It on the Mountain, so the kiddos could just scream from the top of their lungs, go, when people sit like in the front and they're like, mouthing the words and doing the like this thing, and you go, go tell it. And they can tell everybody that Jesus Christ was born today. They get to tell. And then they get to quote the angels, glow, right? And they like are screaming it. And then like think it's so weird to say in Excelsis Deo. And you always get that student or maybe a few students that like gets suddenly like super shy and forgets everything and becomes like a statue and like won't look at anybody. And then you get the girl who twirls their dress instead of singing, and then their parents are just praying that they don't like pull their skirt up over their head, and everybody else thinks it's hilarious, but like the parents are mortified. Putting on a program is so much work, but it is such a joy. Parents record the videos, grandparents beam with pride, the congregation giggles and clap in delight as the youngest among us parades, sometimes sheepishly, across the stage as lambs, shepherds, and innkeepers. The curtains fall and everyone disperses to private celebrations among family and friends. The Reverend Dr. David Lose, who is now the senior pastor at Mount Olivet in Minneapolis, but was a professor at Luther Seminary while I attended, calls what Simeon says in our gospel text today the odd Christmas carol. What he says is often called Simeon's song. It seems like one question screams out to be answered this week. After all the candlelight and joy and the presents and everything else that went along with our Christmas celebrations last week, what in the world are we talking about death for? After all, Luke's account of Simeon's troubling song is simply haunting by the specter of death. Alongside the wonderful Christmas songs we are singing today, this one sounds odd. We need to back up a little bit. To set the stage for you all, this gospel reading is 40 days after Jesus' birth. 8 days after Jesus is born, he has been circumcised in the temple and named according with the Jewish law. That's the couple verses right before our gospel for today. Now, 32 days later, I did the math for you, his parents are again performing their duty as pious Jews by returning to the temple, this time in order to offer a sacrifice and to consecrate their child to the Lord. They may have been in a solemn mood that day, full of reverence and expectancy, or like when young parents have their first child to be baptized, making sure they have everything all lined up, even though probably nothing will go as planned. An old man comes forward out of the shadows and scoops up their child in their arms and prophesy about him. What in the heck? Startled at first, perhaps maybe a little frightened, Mary and Joseph yield to him because they sense the Holy Spirit upon him. Hearing Simeon's prophecy, they are reminded of the events of the previous weeks and months when angels and shepherds had intruded into their lives to foretell the greatness of their son. How confused they must have been, though, at what now we call Simeon's song. Lord, now let your servant go in peace. The words might sound familiar to you. Sometimes it's a hymn sung after communion in some churches. Simeon's words are also part of the service called Compline, the orders for the close of the day. Don't look it up now, but Compline is in the front of your hymnals on page 324 if you are a church nerd like me. And yet, when we hear these words, I can imagine Mary and Joseph did grow strangely uncomfortable. Listen to them again. Lord, now let your servant go in peace. Your word has been fulfilled. My own eyes have seen the salvation which you have prepared in the sight of every people, a light to reveal you to the nations and the glory of your people Israel. Beautiful words, to be sure, but also troubling. For let's not kid ourselves. When Simeon asks that he be allowed to go, he's asking to die. And so I wonder, why does Luke record this strange scene and song? Why would he move from the beauty and the light and the joy of the nativity straight to Simeon's morbid request for death? And why must we focus on that request and therefore on death just a week after our own celebrations of Christmas? I mean, it's the seventh day of Christmas. Aren't there supposed to be swans swimming? And do you see what I mean? What's with all this talk about death doing right in the midst of all the light and life of Christmas? Shouldn't Luke and we leave death outside the door just this once to deal with it later? Like maybe our Christmas bills? Shouldn't we can't we ignore it, deny it, at least while family's still here? Or why we still might have leftovers in our fridge? Or while there's still candy in our stockings? I still have candy in my stocking. But there is, you see, death doesn't take a holiday, does it? And my word, but this is never more apparent than during the holidays. A time when our hopes are regularly joined to our fears. Our expectations so often tinged with regret, and our reunions sometimes overshadowed by unspoken disappointments or hurts. Some of us, and people we know, have lost a loved one in this past year, and that makes Christmas especially difficult. And most of us are reminded of those who have loved and lost by maybe a stanza from a hymn, a favorite ornament on a tree, or some fleeting, vivid memory of a Christmas past. Like for me and my mom, as a family, we would go to the early afternoon service all as a family, and then my mom and I, just the two of us, would go and sit in the front row of the balcony at the latest service so we can see all the candles below us. It was the best place. But then after working in a church, I learned that actually the best place to see all the candles is from the front. Simeon is no different. He's an old man. He's been around the sun a few times. And we can imagine that he has tasted love and loss, joy and despair, hope and fear, just like you and me. And so he sings of death simply because he can't help it. Because he, like us, lives with it every day. Luke is clear that Simeon is able to speak of death so honestly only in the light of the coming of the promised Messiah. Only, that is, by the confidence that in this tiny baby, God has come to redeem Israel and save all the world. Lord, Simeon sings, now you can let your servant go in peace, for your word has been fulfilled. Simeon notices that in this baby, God incarnate, Emmanuel, God is with us, that God has kept God's promises, that in this 40-day-old infant, God has acted once and for all to address the question and the threat of death with the promise of life. Simeon doesn't ask for death. Rather, he accepts it courageously and competently in the light of God's promised salvation. And he does so, again, only upon seeing and holding God's promise in his hands, the promise of life which God granted to him through Christ, and which God grants also to us. This, then, is why we sing Simeon's song in the evening at Compline. For as darkness overtakes the world, we commend ourselves, all of our lives, and our loved ones to God made known through the manger and the cross. Anchored by his promise, we can go to our night's rest in confidence and entrust even in our beloved to the night we know in Jesus. And so we continue singing Simeon's song all these many years after the events Luke records, simply because it tells of God's great love for us, a love that even death cannot destroy. For like Simeon, we also need to hear and see and touch and feel God's promise, the promise that God will be with us and for us forever, the promise announced in the birth of Jesus that we sing about so sweetly. And that is good news. That is God with us. But also God claims us. And you are God's truly beloved. Looking at the Galatians text for today that Tom read, we see that we are God's children, adopted and named as an heir. Under Roman law, adopted children have the same legal status and inheritance rights as biological children. It is significant that Paul does not identify Jews with biological children and Gentiles with adopted children. Rather, he suggests that we are all adopted children. None of us have prior claim on the Father. Our adoption as God's children is pure gift. Jesus alone is Son of God from birth, but he consents to share his relationship and inheritance with us. We are children of God purely by God's grace, and not by us following the law, whatever form that law may take. For instance, we might be in that post-Christmas letdown with all the guilt about the Christmas cards that didn't get sent, the hope for family harmony that didn't quite happen. One of my relatives had a cartoon on Facebook, and it had two boxes, two parts. The first one was a stick figure with a Santa hat, and it said December 1st to the 26th, and underneath it said festive. And in the second box, it said December 27th through the 31st, and it was a stick figure holding a piece of cheese, and it said underneath, confused, full of cheese, unsure what day it is. I personally don't think I've had enough cheese yet this year, but I can make that up today. One way of dealing with all this guilt is by making New Year's resolutions about how we will change, about how we will make a fresh start with the turning of the calendar. And we know how well that turns out, don't we? Paul tells us, you are not a slave. God sent his Son to redeem us from under the law so that we might receive adoption as God's children. God's gift to us will not be canceled, regardless of how well we live up to our own expectations or the expectations of others. We do have a fresh start, not by our own willpower, but by the gracious gift of God in sending his Son, claiming us as God's children, and sending the Spirit into our hearts. This is pure gift, and we cannot earn or deserve it. We can only give thanks and share this gift with others. Amen.